You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 23rd of May, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Is anyone still really trying to free the hostages held in Gaza? The UN votes over some objections and many abstentions to remember Srebrenica, and an expensive new way to make air travel even more annoying. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Nabila Ramdani and Mark Lowcock will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is a letter from Baden-Baden. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Mark Lowcock, Fellow of the Centre for Global Development and former Head of Humanitarian Affairs at the UN, and by Nabila Ramdani, the journalist, broadcaster and author. Nabila, it has been a long time, and you have brought with you a copy of The Reason It Has Been a Long Time. Would you like to shamelessly plug your latest book right now?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, I've been on the road, literally, with my book. Fixing France, it's called How to Repair a Broken Republic. And it's about the state of modern France, what's wrong with it and what could be done about it, essentially. And I've been touring a few universities across the UK, across America, and I'm off to Norway next week because, strangely enough, people are interested in these matters.
Obviously, given the relationship between the two countries, any British listeners will be assuming glibly that a book about what's wrong with France must be 20,000 pages thick. But it's not quite that bad, is it?
Well, to give you an idea, there's also the Olympic Games in the summer, the forthcoming Games in Paris. And there I said the book and the Games are very much intertwined in the sense that they both say so much about modern France and where it's going. And, as audiences might have noticed, there's much discontent in France if you measure it by the number of people who take to the streets regularly.
I mean, that is an observation that could have been made about France at roughly any point in the last 1,000 years, however.
Yes, precisely.
I mean, I have said before, Mark, that I do actually kind of think that throwing cafe tables at the gendarmes should be an exhibition sport at this Olympics as a demonstration of the local municipal culture. You, moving seamlessly along, have not, unless there's something you're not telling us, been throwing any outdoor furniture at the police, but you have been to Bath.
I've been to Bath, one of the literary capitals of the UK, and of course where Jane Austen did much of her best work, where Henry James is thought to have written much of Tom Jones. And I went to one of my favourite bookshops, actually, across the whole of the world. I have a few cities where I love the bookshops, and Bath is right up there. And they also have a great literary festival. So I hope that your work will be prominently available in Bath this weekend as the literati gather to enjoy the latest books.
Bath is indeed a delightful city, very much recommended to any visitors to the UK. But we will start today's show proper in Gaza, and with the efforts of families of 5 Israeli women still held hostage by Hamas to remind Israel's government that their release was supposed to have been an aim of Israel's ongoing operations in Gaza. The families have released new footage of the moments that the women were taken from the Nahal Oz military base amid the Hamas attacks of last October 7th. 2 others were captured at the same time. One was rescued, one is confirmed dead. All had been serving as observers, monitoring the fortifications separating Gaza from Israel. The new footage is not recommended for the squeamish. Hamas have claimed, not convincingly, that the film has been manipulated. Mark, first of all, there are still believed to be 125 Israeli hostages in Gaza, 37 of which are now presumed dead. But do we think that the hostages actually are a priority for Israel, despite what Israel keeps insisting?
Well, they're certainly a priority for a significant number of Israelis.
By Israel, I mean, Israel's government at the moment.
Well, of course, what we're seeing now is the Israeli military increasingly struggling against a adaptable and determined insurgency, which we've seen all around the world is a difficult thing to do. We see increasing divisions inside the Israeli government because there's a lack of clarity from Netanyahu on what the plan for the future is. And that is giving more space and voice to those who, as you said at the top, Andrew, are complaining that the government isn't acting on what it says is one of its top priorities, which is getting the hostages released. And I mean, there's various scenarios people are talking about on how this will play out. But I do think absent a more credible plan than we've seen from the Israeli authorities at the moment, those voices on at least let us get the hostages out are going to become more and more dominant.
Nabila, there are negotiations ongoing, or at least so we're told, and there have been throughout this period. But Hamas is presumably going to want something in exchange for the return of further hostages. But given the state that Hamas are now in and the state that their fiefdom of Gaza is now in, is there really anything they can be offered? I mean, Hamas surely understand at this point that they are pretty much done for as an organisation.
Well, I think, Israel and Hamas don't want the same thing.
Clearly.
Israel has so far refused 4 times to agree to a ceasefire. And since the Hamas attack on October the 7th, there have been multiple times when they were negotiating to come to an agreement on that. But I think, on the Hamas side, they want a permanent ceasefire with the release of what they call their own hostages, which is now up to 8,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails, including children. And the Israeli side, they want a temporary ceasefire and potentially resume offensives on the Gaza Strip with the release of all the hostages. So there is a deadlock. They don't clearly are not coming to an agreement, and not least of all because in the meantime, Israeli offensives continue, not just on the Gaza Strip, where now more than 35,000 people have been killed, including 15,000 children, and there's many more victims under the rubble. But there's also consistent attacks, regular attacks in the West Bank. I mean, since October the 7th, more than 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank. Only yesterday there were attacks. And only yesterday as well, we heard from the Prime Minister Netanyahu saying that there is no innocent Palestinian. So this kind of language is not conducive to any peace agreement. And dare I say, the military solution is not a plausible one because it very much characterizes the kind of conflict that has been going on for decades between, the Palestinian side and indeed Israel.
Mark, is Benjamin Netanyahu, and he is thinking like a politician because he is a politician, it is clear that one of his imperatives is to try to stay in his job and thereby potentially stay out of jail. But just if we look at this from his perspective, he's kind of stuck, isn't he? Because on the one hand, he has a choice between trying to please the families of the hostages and those many Israelis sympathetic to them, who frankly are the kind of people who aren't going to vote for him anyway, and pleasing the headbangers that he has to please in order to keep his coalition together.
He's stuck because he doesn't have a plan for the day after and what to do next. And I actually think the least bad and most plausible of all the available plans, given that I really don't think full-scale Israeli permanent military occupation of Gaza, which would be difficult and expensive and unpopular, is viable. I think he's really struggling to get other countries to be willing to contemplate providing some kind of peacekeeping operation in Gaza. I think the centre of gravity is heading towards having to face some kind of accommodation under which Hamas release the remaining hostages, some of the Palestinians get released, aid is allowed in properly, and there's a recognition that Israel's going to have to do a much better job than it did before the 7th of October in defending its borders, because Hamas or people like them are going to be playing a role in the civil administration of Gaza because no one else wants to or can.
Just a final thought on this, Nabila. I think Mark is correct to point out, as many people have, that the Israelis do not appear to have a plan. There's no idea about what the day after hostilities cease will look like. And I mean, there are people in the Israeli war cabinet making that complaint. But Is it clear that Hamas have any better idea of what to them victory would look like? It's never been clear to me, completely unsympathetic to them though I am, what they thought October 7th was going to accomplish. But from the position they're in now, is it clear what they actually want, what they think a victory would look like?
Well, I think, generally speaking, you can take the history of any nation, and the more you oppress people, the more you radicalize them, and the more Hamas offensives you have, and the more they're dealt with by the full force of the, American-backed military-industrial complex, the more conflicts will go on and on and on. So, and when you see videos, for example, of, and it's just the case of, an extreme government in Israel at the moment, when you see videos of settlers assisted by Israeli army stopping aid trucks, entering Gaza and then destroying the food on board, then that really sums up the horror of what's going on in this conflict. And, starvation tactics are now being condemned by the highest courts internationally. And I think it's absolutely right that now the courts, international courts, are attempting to criminalize the guilty men on both sides.
But does it strike you that Hamas right now do have a plan, or are they an organisation who perhaps might now just feel like this has all gone off in their face a bit?
Well, I don't think that anybody would command the result of their actions. But conversely, there are plenty of people who are saying that, the bigger picture is not really about what Hamas has done on October the 7th. It's about the greater injustice in this part of the Middle East, and in fact, having more freedoms for the Palestinian, and indeed having, a viable Palestinian state for Palestinians with an Israeli state, and both having the right to security and equal rights. So I don't think that this kind of tit-for-tat attacks are resolving anything until, the bigger comprehensive picture is being dealt with.
Well, to the United Nations now, and to a reminder that the Middle East is far from the only place in the world where two groups of people can contemplate exactly the same events and derive irreconcilably divergent conclusions. The UN General Assembly has voted today to make July 11th the International Day of Remembrance of the Srebrenica genocide. It will be 29 years this summer since Bosnian Serb army troops murdered around 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys in and around Srebrenica, pretty much under the collective nose of ineffectual UN peacekeepers. Serbia's government has objected with characteristic belligerent self-pity, while current Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik has reiterated his denial that any such genocide ever occurred. Well, we're joined first of all by Monocle's Balkans correspondent Guy Delaunay. Guy, on a scale of 1 to Krakatoa, how nuts is Serbia going about this?
It's been going nuts ahead of the vote for quite a long time. But in terms of the reaction to what's happened today, I think you're already seeing the spin being applied, not within Serbia, but by Milorad Dodik, the Bosnian Serb leader, who's described the vote at the UN as a failure because he said 84 countries voted for the resolution. That's not an absolute majority. And of course, if you add it up, you've got the 19 who voted against, plus I'm getting my notes here, the abstentions were 68. So it's actually more voted against and abstained than voted for. And in Milorad Dodik's eyes, that's some sort of a victory. But, that's what will be going on now with Serbia. There'll be the spin which has followed this campaign of lobbying ahead of time. There will be attempts to spin this now, saying, well, look, there wasn't a majority of nations who voted in favour of the resolution, therefore we've achieved something here by doing that. So I think that's what's been going on. We've had a lot of rumbling, the odd minor eruption ahead of time, but there isn't going to be the full-on Krakatoa just because this resolution has actually been passed.
If we look at Serbia itself, what is its official line on what actually happened at Srebrenica? Is Aleksandar Vučić, Serbia's president, for example, all in on the complete denial that any such thing occurred? Or is he just trying to spin the line that, terrible things happen in war, it's all dreadfully unfortunate, but we were no worse than anybody else, etc.?
Well, I was at Srebrenica on the 20th anniversary of the massacre in 2015, and Aleksandar Vučić was there, and I saw him being bottled in essence, at Srebrenica. He'd gone there to pay his respects. He'd gone to lay a wreath at the Potocari Memorial Centre. And I can remember him now, my mind's eye, I'd have to check the footage to see if this is correct, but being sheltered by umbrellas from a hail of plastic bottles that was descending upon him. But that shows you that the Vučić does, of course, admit that what happened in Srebrenica, that 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys were murdered by Bosnian Serb forces. What he has never said, and what he will never say, in my opinion, is that constituted genocide. You had, in 2010, a resolution passed in Serbia's National Assembly, which was before Mr. Vučić and his Progressive Party came to power, and that resolution apologised to Bosnia, the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina, to the people who died in the massacre and their relatives. It apologised to them for Serbia not doing everything that it could have done to prevent the massacre. It acknowledged that it was a terrible event and should not have happened. But once again, it did not call it genocide. So Serbia's always steered away from this word, although it's also worth pointing out that it's never contested the verdicts at the tribunal in The Hague, which has found numerous individuals, including Bosnian Serb military chief Ratko Mladic and the political boss Radovan Karadzic, guilty of genocide in connection with Srebrenica. So it's a funny old position, and for whatever reason, you won't get the words genocide out of too many Serbian leaders.
Guy Delaunay, thank you. Let's bring our panel back in. Mark, this is the UN, where you used to work, I think doesn't regard Srebrenica as anywhere close to its finest hour. Is there an element of apology about this resolution, do you think?
No, I don't think so. In 2015, it's worth recalling, Guy was just talking about other things in 2015. The UK then tried to get similar resolution through the Security Council and the Russians vetoed it. I think there's a genuine desire in the UN when very, very bad things happen to try to make sure they're remembered in the hope of avoiding them in future. I think one of the issues here is how the genocide term itself is applied. I've just been reviewing a book on what's happened in Tigray 2020 to 2022, where a lot of people think 600,000 people were killed in the war and by deliberate action. And a lot of Tigrayans I know think that they were subject to a genocide. Of course, in Darfur in 2005, the likes of George Clooney and others famously were trying to argue that the Rapid Support Forces, now of course led by Hemeti, one of the leaders of the all the fighting that's going on in Sudan, that was a genocide as well. So there is the concept of genocide has two dimensions. There's a political use of the word, and then there's a legal use of the word. And I think one of the beauties, in my mind, if you like, I know in some other people's minds, flaws of the UN is this constructive ambiguity of the way in which the word is used according to the occasion.
Because under some readings of the Genocide Convention, Nabila, if you believe that such a thing is actually happening, your nation is not merely permitted to act, but actually obliged to act, which is why we do see people tiptoeing around it very carefully. I think I recall rightly President Bill Clinton at the time wittering inanely about acts of genocide in Rwanda rather than calling it an actual genocide. But has it been too widely forgotten that it does have quite a narrow legal definition? Because certainly in modern discourse, it has just become a word denoting civilian casualties in any military operation I happen personally to disagree with.
Well, as Mark was quite rightly highlighting, in fact, Srebrenica was described by United Nations as the worst crime on European soil since the Second World War, and the massacre has already been classified as genocide by the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia. And I think it's important to attach this kind of a definition to such horrors, because it's a reminder, for example, in the case of Srebrenica, of how ultranationalism can and actually did lead to dehumanization and ethnic cleansing of around 100,000 Bosnian Muslims who were murdered and 8,373 men and boys in Srebrenica alone. And more than that, there were 2 million people who were displaced, over 50,000 women were systematically raped. And the driving force behind this campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing was built on the belief that one group of people was superior to the other, and it created divisions based on this kind of ideology. And I think we should very much bear all this in mind as the death toll rises in Gaza, well above the 35,000 mark, compared to 8,000 plus in Srebrenica.
Mark, just a final quick thought on this. The resolution that was voted on today was written by Rwanda and Germany. Is there a particular reason, do you think, why some countries seem to be a lot better than others at confronting their past and learning something from it?
Well, I think if you have in the living memory of people alive now such total horrors as were perpetrated by the Nazis and experienced in Rwanda, and then everyone learns about it in school, it infuses its way into lots of other things. I think it's quite impressive and striking, actually, how Germany and Rwanda have got together to do this. As I mentioned earlier, the UK had to go in the Security Council. It's not quite the same thing. So I think if there were more countries who were willing to try to learn from the past and avoid repetition of mistakes, the world would be a slightly better place. And if the UN can provide a theatre for that, good for the UN.
Well, sticking with the theme of Rwanda, it would appear that the UK's madcap plan to send seaborne asylum seekers there is going to end up being an even better result for Rwanda than it looked. Rwanda has already trousered circa 220 million quid for its participation in this nonsense and has so far settled one asylum seeker who agreed to go after he was bunged a further 3,000. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who called a general election for July 4th yesterday, has conceded that there will only be any further flights to Rwanda if he is re-elected. And as he won't be, there won't be. Nabila, is it clear to any of us what the point of any of this has actually been?
Not to me in any case, and it seems not to many people either. And I think technically the Rwanda policy can actually be looked at as a foreign policy matter in the general election, as it involves an African country many thousands of miles away from Britain. I think Rishi Sunak and his government, his ministers, were trying to get the first migrant flight off to Rwanda before polling day in order to showcase that their flagship policy on countering illegal migration was working. But now the PM is saying that it might still go ahead if he is re-elected on July the 4th.
Yeah, I think, you can go into any bookmaker and write your own ticket on that eventuality. Mark, I never understood this policy for a lot of reasons. I didn't understand it from the perspective that clearly it was never going to work and never going to happen. But even if it had, even if a few planes had taken off, does it strike you as the kind of thing that would actually have won over a single voter?
What the pollsters say is that people care a lot about this problem. They are,
and to be clear, it is a problem. It is a non-zero number of people arriving through dangerous ad hoc means every year.
Stopping the boats is an important thing to try to do. The difficulty is that it's hard. And the reason the Rwanda scheme was so mad was because it was never going to deter enough people to justify the costs. And so it's also clear that there weren't going to be any more flights in July because the courts were going to intervene again. So, in fact, there's a whole bunch of reasons why us lucky citizens here in this country are going to get to vote on the 4th of July. One of them is they didn't want to have to suffer the ignominy of another summer where they failed to deal with this problem. So I think that's the main thing that's going on here. The Labour Party, if they win, have got different plans for dealing with the problem. It's going to be hard, though, but try at least to have a rational approach to doing it.
I mean, I think it's about 40,000 people in the last year who have arrived by this means in the United Kingdom. I can't off the top of my head divide 220 million by 40,000, but I do rather suspect, Nabila, that the money would have been just better spent as seed capital for everybody who came ashore. It's like, off you go, good luck. But there is a conventional wisdom at large that there are no votes in foreign policy, that they don't tip domestic elections. Do you believe that or not believe that?
Well, not least of all because the Rwanda policy will be a massive dividing line between the two parties over the 6-week election campaign. But, general elections usually focus on domestic policies, and it's been said that for these general elections, the main topics will be the economy, the NHS, the cost of living, and indeed immigration. But there is no doubt that foreign policy, and especially in relation to what's going on in the Middle East and in Gaza, will play a big part, not least of all because the Labour Party in particular has let down its traditional voters on the issue of upholding human rights and upholding international and humanitarian human rights in relation to that conflict. A lot of voters will remember how the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, who has a background in international human rights law, validated Israel's position on cutting off electricity and water supplies for the Gaza population. And indeed, it took him an awful lot of time to advocate a ceasefire. And that's the reason why you've got a surge of independent candidates now in many areas, who will be challenging Labour Party politicians.
Mark, just finally on this, the polls, however, do not suggest that this has done Starmer all that much damage. Is he right to assume that while there are people who are very passionate about this, there's actually not that many of them?
I think he probably is, in all honesty. What Starmer's trying to do is look as he would see it, normal as possible, getting back to a mainstream type of Labour policy that people associated with going all the way back to Callaghan and Blair and Brown. And anything that looks more Corbynista is by definition right off the agenda. But overall, above all, he wants this to be an election fought on domestic issues, which expose the failures of the government over the last 14 years and convey the sense that if you change, things don't have to get better, but they can get better.
Well, finally for today's panel...
Who let the dogs out? Who let the dogs out?
Which is by way of fanfaring that later this evening, the first flight by new airline Bark Air will depart New York City for Los Angeles. As the name of Bark Air strongly suggests, the airline is heavily dog-focused, offering canines a more comfortable ride than they might find in cargo, or whimpering on the lap of their owner while everyone in surrounding seats fantasises grimly about heaving both through the exit doors. Bark Air owns no aircraft of its own, instead chartering Gulfstream G5s, listeners beginning to suspect that this service is pitched at the more money than sense demographic may now enjoy the revelation that the one-way flight for one Mutt Plus owner is about $6,000. Mark, fools and their money soon parted, etc.
Well, Andrew, pets are people too.
No, they're not.
I am completely thrilled with this initiative, above all because it will more or less guarantee that I don't have to share the cabin anymore with the canine. I would like to know whether my goldfish qualify. I think
in America, Mark, if you say it's your emotional support goldfish, you're in business.
I'm willing to say anything necessary.
Just to be clear, Nabila, I am very much pro-dog, pro-cat, pro-most varieties of pet. However, this sounds ghastly.
Yes, I very much agree with you. I think anything that has a stupid name like Bark Air is pretty much stupid, and I doubt this is an exception. I think, it's a very much a stupid name based on a very stupid idea, dare I say, and I would certainly not allow my animal pets on board a flight prioritising them over humans, Mark.
Because I'm going to go ahead and float Mark, the fact that growing up as a child in Australia and growing up in a military family in Australia, we moved a great deal over long distances. And we had pets which at time to time one would not wish to share a car with. We put them on planes. It did not, so far as it was possible to tell, do them any harm riding in cargo.
Well, that's where I am as well.
Yeah.
I think the issue is the desire for some pet owners to have their dogs and cats with them in the cabin. And, of course, there's enough people with enough disposable income that they are creating a market for this new service because that first flight is sold out.
It is sold out. I don't think they had to sell that many tickets. But I did want to ask you both in closing, have you ever had a particularly memorable experience with airborne livestock? Have you flown on any of those picturesque airlines in less reconstructed climes where there's goats and chickens wandering up and down the aisles? Anything of that sort?
Not particularly, but I think, we moan enough when we see some human being sitting behind, in the curtains in business or premium economy. Well, we're all packed like sardines in economy class. So imagine what it's like, what it would be like to have actual dogs sitting behind the curtains.
The reason I asked, Mark, is I was once on a flight, a mercifully short one from Palermo to Turin or Milan, somewhere like that. And there was somebody on the plane with a lap-sized dog that whined at exactly the kind of pitch that makes human teeth itch for the entire flight. She was genuinely lucky to get off that plane alive.
So the closest I've got, Andrew, was in 1983, flying from Khartoum to Juba, when none of us were allowed to get off the plane before a calf had been slaughtered at the steps of the gantry. I think mostly in surprise that the plane had made it all the way from Khartoum to Juba.
Well, on that picturesque note, Sir Mark Lowcock and Nabila Ramdani, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, time for the latest instalment in our series of letters from. This week we have a letter from Baden-Baden, so good they named it twice, but more recently facing controversy over its many Russian inhabitants. Here is Monocle's Emma Nelson.
Baden-Baden is a place ripe for the game, could I live here? That semi-serious discussion you have as you stroll through the small town, well-fed and probably well-watered at the end of a lovely day. Because it ticks every box. Tucked away in the Black Forest, it's pretty wherever you look. In the centre at least is the pinkest of churches, the greenest of evergreens, the sweetest of family-run hotels. Tick. Its situation is very good. There's a direct train up from Zurich and then further north up to Hamburg. Hop over the border and enjoy a French lunch in Strasbourg. Its tiny airport is a former Canadian military airbase from where you can hop neatly across Europe. It has culture in abundance. The former train station converted into a smart modern concert hall. And above all, there's a spa. Every day, 800,000 litres of thermal water bubble up from a depth of 2 kilometres underground. The temperature is still almost 70 Celsius, and the water brings with it minerals that heal. Roman soldiers were sent to recover from war injuries, and from the waters sprang a town, which by the 19th century was called the summer capital of Europe. Bob around in the town's pristine municipal baths and enjoy an immediate reset. Underwater jets invisibly pummel tired bodies. If you nip next door to the naked, more traditional spa for something rather more gripping but transformative, you enter a shy soul. You emerge a nymph. I have sat in bubbly water in December with snowfall landing on my shoulders. Those same shoulders have also needed sunscreen to shield me from the warm summer sun. Baden-Baden, UNESCO World Heritage Site, and so good they really did name it twice. But today Baden-Baden has become a lightning rod for the international crossroads Germany finds itself at. Thanks to its spa and casino, for centuries the town has been a playground for the rich, and in particular, rich Russians. This place operates in 3 languages. The estate agent signs are in German, Russian and English. in that order. Although if you need to ask the price of the houses the Muscovites snapped up, then they're probably not for you. The main strip boasts the only Fabergé egg museum outside of Russia. The concert hall has drawn Moscow's classical superstars. But then, two things happened. COVID killed off many shops, even the stalwarts of the old town. And then Russia's invasion of Ukraine knocked this place and Germany further sideways. Cheap Russian energy had powered the country's heavy manufacturing. But with Nord Streams 1 and 2, the pipelines built to bring Russian energy to Europe, either blown up or disconnected, the shock led to a serious drop in living standards across the country, and the Russians were pushed out. The big houses, beyond the budget of most locals, were put up for sale. Anna Netrebko, opera's answer to Beyoncé and beloved by President Putin, was ditched from the concert hall's schedule. The Sochi Business and Tourism Centre now lies empty in Baden-Baden. Taped to the window are 3 sheets of A4 paper with the words, "We want peace," although it's not clear on what terms. But while Germany has become one of Kyiv's biggest suppliers of military aid, quietly Baden-Baden finds it hard to cut ties with Moscow. Local hoteliers and restaurants quietly say a few of the Russians are back. You hear the language spoken, albeit discreetly, in the spa. And Anna Netrebko returned to the stage of the festival last year, although concert-goers were told to use the side entrances to avoid the protests. History may well play its part, but Baden-Baden knows that, like its spa, it will always have to spring back to life.
That was Emma Nelson in Baden-Baden, and that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Sir Mark Lowcock and Nabila Ramdani, also to Guy Delaunay. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermack and researched by Gunnar Gronlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.